A widowed rancher needed someone for his son, and only a Japanese woman answered. She stepped off the supply wagon with a lacquered box and almost no English, on a frontier that had no use for either. The boy hadn't spoken since the day they buried his mother, and no amount of ranch toughness had pulled him back. The town called her a foreigner and waited for her to fail. Sure, a grieving child doesn't mend at the hands of a stranger who kneels and whisks green powder into a bowl. What she did instead changed the boy, the rancher, and the meaning of home in ways no one in that valley saw coming. If you want to see how a woman who never raised her voice taught a silent boy to speak again, stay until the very end and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The Two Rivers Ranch sat at the far edge of Montana Territory, where the land rolled long and empty before it hit the mountains. A man could ride all morning out there without meeting another living soul. Elias Vaughn had built the place with his hands and his silence, 40 head of cattle and a solid house of squared timber. His name carried weight in the territory because he never had to raise it to be heard. That was the year before the boy broke. A year had passed since they buried Cora in the small fenced plot on the ridge, and the house hadn't been the same house since. The boy who lived in it had stopped being the same boy. Samuel was 8. He'd been a loud child, quick to laugh, always underfoot, the kind of boy who followed his mother from room to room like a small orbiting moon. The morning they lowered Cora into the ground, the orbit stopped. He didn't cry at the funeral, and he didn't speak on the ride home, and he didn't speak the day after. The silence settled over him like a second skin that no one could reach through. Elias tried the things a frontier man knows. Work came first. The boy set to stacking fence rails until the small hands blistered. A strap came next, once. The boy looked at him with eyes so empty that Elias put the strap away and never touched it again. Then a hired woman from Cedar Falls, a broad farmer's widow who lasted 6 days before she quit, telling Elias flat that the child wasn't grieving, but possessed. The boy's grief didn't sit still. It moved through him like a current and came out as wreckage. He broke the kitchen window with a rock and stood looking at the shards without expression. He scorched a corner of the barn hay with a lifted coal and would have burned the structure down if a hand hadn't smelled the smoke. When the foreman tried to pull him out from under the tack room floor, where he'd crawled to hide, the boy bit the man's thumb hard enough to scar. He wouldn't eat at the table, wouldn't sleep in his bed, wouldn't walk past the peg by the front door where Cora's riding coat still hung, its hem dark with old mud, untouched since the last time she wore it. A preacher came down from Cedar Falls once, a tall, thin man who thought silence in a child was a prayer waiting to be said. He sat with the boy for an hour and got nothing back, not a glance, not a nod. He left telling Elias the boy would speak when God was ready and not before, which was the kind of answer the territory gave when it had no answer at all. The women in town had their own version, that the child had been spoiled by a soft mother and needed harder handling. The men had theirs, that a boy who wouldn't work was a boy who hadn't been worked enough. Every version laid the fault at a different door, and none of them opened the one that mattered. Elias listened to all of it and used none of it. None of the people talking had watched the boy orbit that coat for a year, and none of them knew the silence wasn't stubbornness, but a verdict the child had passed on himself. He left the coat where it was. He couldn't move it, and he didn't examine why, because examining it would have meant opening a door he'd braced shut with work and silence and the daily discipline of cattle and fence lines. The coat stayed. The boy orbited around it the way he used to orbit around her, giving it a wide berth, never looking directly at it, his whole small life bent around the shape of what was missing. The foreman was a lean man named Whit, who had ridden with Elias for 9 years. He watched the boy wreck the place and said little, because there was nothing to say that Elias didn't already know. The advertisement went into the Cedar Falls paper in the back pages. 3 lines, plain. Wanted. Someone to care for a boy, 8 years, room and board and wages, the Two Rivers Ranch. Elias wrote it with the same hand that branded cattle and signed warrants, and the brevity of it was its own kind of desperation. He didn't ask for a wife or a mother. He asked for someone to care for the boy, because he'd admitted, in the only way he could admit a thing, that he couldn't do it alone. Whit read the notice over his shoulder and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said only that no one in the territory would come, because no one had been able to reach the child in a year, and a stranger would do no better. Elias folded the paper and sent it anyway. The silence that followed it was the same silence that filled his house. The supply wagon came up the valley road 2 days late, which was nothing unusual for the territorial routes. A flooded creek or a thrown shoe could cost a man a week out there. What was unusual was the figure sitting beside the driver on the high bench, small and still, a dust-coated trail coat pulled tight over a faded kimono the color of old plums, a lacquered box resting on her knees. Hana Mori had answered the advertisement from a boarding house in Helena, where she'd been washing lemons for 5 months since the crossing. She'd come the only way a woman with no money and no English comes, which is on whatever wagon will have her. She stepped down onto the packed dirt of the yard, and the height of the sky seemed to settle onto her shoulders. Her frame was small and thin in a way that spoke of hunger rather than delicacy, her hair pulled back tight, her face all sharp angles and high bones, and eyes so dark they looked black in the shadow of the wagon. She didn't say anything to Elias, who had come out onto the porch with his arms crossed and his face going hard as stone. She just looked at him, and then she looked past him to the house. The stillness with which she held herself was the kind of calm that only comes from having already accepted the worst possible outcome. Elias had expected a sturdy frontier woman, broad hands, a face lined by weather and work, someone who would understand the territory because the territory had made her. He got this. His jaw set, and the cold understanding moved through him that the advertisement and the woman standing in his yard didn't match. Someone had played them both for fools, or no one else had come at all, and the paper had reached only the desperate. He'd built his reputation on reading men, and what he read in her wasn't weakness, and not fear, but a patience he didn't believe a person could own. It unsettled him more than weakness would have. The boy appeared in the doorway behind Elias, saw the stranger, and walked the other way without a sound. Hana watched him go, and her eyes tracked not his face, but the set of his shoulders, the way he held his arms close, the careful wide path he took around the peg where the riding coat hung. She didn't follow him. She set the lacquered box down on the porch boards and placed her palm flat across its lid for a moment, a gesture so small and private that Elias almost missed it. It was the same unconscious motion the boy made when he passed the coat, a hand reaching toward a thing it couldn't touch. The box was the size of a saddlebag and finished in black lacquer worn to grain at the corners, and she didn't open it that first day. It would become the most important object in the house. It would stay closed for 3 days, because she hadn't come to unpack but to learn the shape of the wound before she touched it. Inside were the tools her grandmother had used in a tea room in Kyoto, brought across an ocean and a continent and a grief of her own. When the box finally opened, the smell of them wouldn't belong to Montana territory at all. She'd come because she was stranded. Her husband had died of a fever on the ship between Yokohama and San Francisco. She'd landed alone in a country that had no use for a woman who couldn't ask for water in its language. She'd washed and sewn and survived from city to city until the advertisement reached her. She needed a roof and a reason, and the boy in the doorway needed something she couldn't yet name. The distance between those two needs was the distance she'd spend the season crossing. Elias didn't know any of this. He saw only a small foreign woman with a box and no English standing in his yard. He let her stay because the alternative was to send her back down a road that had already cost her more than he could count. The first week was a fence, and the boy tested every plank of it. He dumped the water she drew from the well, one bucket after another, and stood watching to see what she'd do. She drew it again. He hid her shoes inside the tack room and her one good knife in the hayloft. She went barefoot into the kitchen and cut the vegetables with a strip of tin she bent into an edge, and she said nothing about it. He ran to the river in the afternoons and stayed gone until dark. She didn't chase him, and she didn't tell Elias. When the boy came trudging back up the slope, she was waiting at the door with food on the table and a lamp lit, and she said nothing then either. What she did instead of punish was build. In the bare packed yard beside the kitchen door, where the rain had turned the dirt to a hard, pale flat, she made a rake from 3 sticks lashed to a crossbar and began to level a square of ground. She dragged the implement in long, slow, parallel lines until the dirt held the pattern like corduroy. She raked every morning before the boy woke. The lines were straight and even and spaced the width of a hand. She set 3 river stones into the square in a way that wasn't random. The boy watched from the kitchen window and sneered at it, the first expression besides blankness she'd seen on his face. The sneer was ugly, and it was also a crack in the stone, because a sneer is a feeling, and feeling is the door she was looking for. She offered him the rake. He took it, weighed it in his hand, and threw it into the dust, and walked away down the slope. She picked it up and kept raking, and she didn't look after him, because looking after him would have made it a contest, and she wasn't interested in winning a contest with a child who was already losing everything else. The garden wasn't a garden in any sense the territory understood. It grew nothing, it fed nothing, it was only raked dirt and 3 stones. Whit leaned on the corral rail and watched her drag the stick back and forth, and told Elias he'd hired a woman who had lost her mind. Elias said nothing, but he watched her rake the same lines she'd raked the morning before, and something in the repetition of it, the refusal to make it dramatic, held his attention in a way he couldn't have explained. The storm came on the 5th day, the territorial kind that turns the sky the color of a bruise and drops a month of water in an hour. Elias was 3 sections out riding fence, and the boy, mid-run, was caught at the river crossing where the water came up fast and brown and mean. Hannah saw him go, and she didn't hesitate, and she didn't shout. She simply went after him on foot down the slope with the rain driving sideways into her face. She reached the crossing as the boy lost his footing on the submerged log and went into the current. He clung to a flooded snag 10 feet out, the water tearing at him, his small fingers white on the bark. She waded into the waist and caught him by the back of the shirt and hauled him up the bank with a calm that had no fear in it, only task. She carried him home soaked and silent, his weight against her shoulder, and set him by the kitchen stove and stripped the wet clothes off him and wrapped him in a blanket. She didn't scold, and she didn't cry, and she didn't say a single word about what had just happened. The boy didn't thank her. He sat shivering, and he looked at the floor, and when she knelt and wiped the mud from his face with a damp cloth, he didn't pull away. It was the first time in a year he'd let another person that close to his face. The letting was so small a thing that only someone trained to read silence would have seen it for what it was. That was the beginning of trust. On the 3rd night she opened the box. Elias was sitting at the kitchen table cleaning a bridle. He looked up when the lacquered lid lifted. The smell that came out of it was green and bitter and old, and didn't belong to any room he had ever been in. She laid a cloth on the floor near the cold stove and set out her few things with the care a man gives a rifle, each piece in its place. He watched her do it, and felt the discipline of the arrangement before he understood any of it. There was a ceramic bowl, the green of wet moss, a whisk cut from a single piece of bamboo so fine the tines caught the lamplight, a small bamboo scoop, a lacquered caddy that held a dark powder, a square of silk she folded and refolded with precise turns of her fingers. She heated water in the kettle and began. What Elias saw wasn't sorcery and not foolishness, but a sequence of small, exact acts done in the same order with the same attention. The attention itself was the thing he couldn't name. She wiped each tool with the silk cloth, slowly, turning it in her hands, and the wiping wasn't cleaning because the tools were already clean. She warmed the bowl with hot water and rinsed the whisk in it. She scooped the green powder with the bamboo scoop and tapped it into the bowl, and poured the water and whisked until a fine foam stood on the surface. Then she turned the bowl in her hands, a quarter turn, and lifted it and drank, and set it down and began again. The boy was told to sit, but he stood in the doorway instead and watched with the same sneer. She didn't force him, and she set a second bowl on the cloth and left it there and went on with her own. The second morning he was in the doorway again. The third morning he was one step inside the room. The fourth he sat on the threshold with his knees drawn up. The fifth he was inside the room sitting against the wall, and she hadn't asked him once. Slowness was the point, and Elias began to understand it the way he understood breaking a horse. A man doesn't pull the animal to him. He stands still long enough that the animal decides to come. He watched her turn the bowl before she drank, a small quarter rotation so the front of it faced away from her. He didn't know it was respect, and he didn't need to know, because the boy copied it without being told on the morning he finally sat at the cloth. She'd given him nothing to resist. There was no order in the ritual, no command, no expectation he could push against. A boy who had spent a year pushing against everything met a thing that didn't push back and didn't move and didn't end. The absence of a fight undid him more than any fight would have. The kitchen was quiet in those mornings, and the quiet wasn't the empty quiet of the house since Cora died, but a different kind, a held quiet. The kind that comes when someone is paying close attention to a small thing on purpose. She poured the water from the iron kettle in a thin, steady stream, and the steam came up and curled and was gone. She did every part of it at the same unhurried pace. The pace was the lesson the boy couldn't have heard if she'd spoken it aloud. Elias caught himself leaning forward in his chair to watch the foam rise on the surface of the bowl. He straightened and felt foolish, because a grown man sitting forward to watch a woman whisk tea was a thing the territory would have laughed at. And yet the discipline of her hands held him the way a well-set fence line held his eye, the appeal of a thing done right and done the same every time. He hadn't known that stillness could be taught, because in his experience, stillness was a thing a man forced himself into against the noise. Here was a woman for whom the stillness came first, and the work moved inside it. This was the first true stillness after the river, and it settled into the house like weather. Whit came to the door one morning and saw the boy sitting on the floor watching the woman whisk the green powder, and he went away without speaking. The next morning he raked the path to the well without being asked, because the discipline of the house had begun to spread into the yard the way water spreads into dry ground, slowly and without sound. On the sixth morning she handed the boy the whisk. He took it, and his hand wasn't steady. He held it the way a child holds a thing he doesn't trust himself with, too tight and at the wrong angle. She didn't take it back. She put her hand over his and showed him the motion, A turn from the wrist and not from the arm, quick and small. She moved his hand through it once and then let go. He tried, and the powder splashed up green onto the cloth and onto his wrist. His face went tight, and he threw the whisk down and stood up and turned to leave. She said the first sharp thing he had heard her say, which was a single word in her own language that he didn't understand, but whose tone he understood completely. And the tone meant he wasn't finished. She made him pick it up. She made him sit back down, not with anger, but with the flat certainty that a man finishes what he begins, the same certainty with which Elias finished a fence line or a brand. The boy sat because there was no arguing with a calm that absolute. He tried again, and the foam was wrong, thin and gray, and she shook her head and had him empty the bowl and start over. He tried a third time, and a fourth, and on the fifth the foam stood up pale and stiff and right. His eyes went to the bowl, then to her. She nodded once. He turned the bowl the way she turned it, and he drank. The bitterness of it made his face twist, and he didn't spit it out. He finally spoke, and the word was rough and small, and came out of him like a stone pulled from a packed wheel. It was a request for more of the powder, said in English, broken and reluctant and real. Elias was in the doorway with the bridle half in his hand. When the word came out of his son, he stopped moving the way a man stops when he hears a sound he'd decided he'd never hear again. He didn't enter the room. The bridle slid down against his leg, and he let it, because to move would have broken whatever thin thing was forming on the kitchen floor. He knew it the way he knew cattle, by the stillness of the animal. The town tested it a week later. Hannah walked into Cedar Falls to buy rice and a little sugar and a few sheets of paper, because the boy had begun to want things, and she'd begun to let him want them. The general store was the center of the town's opinion, and the opinion had been forming since the supply wagon dropped her, and it wasn't kind. The owner served her slow, setting the rice down out of reach. Two ranchers sitting on the cracker barrel made their thoughts plain in voices built to carry, slow words about foreign women and the men too soft to send them back. One of them stepped into the aisle and didn't move, blocking the path to the counter. Hannah stood with the rice in her arms and didn't beg and didn't flinch and didn't lower her eyes. Elias wasn't called. He came because he'd ridden in for mail and saw her wagon at the hitch and walked into the store and read the room in 2 seconds, the way he read a brush fire, by the direction everyone was looking. He didn't shout. He crossed the floor and placed himself between her and the man in the aisle. He looked at the owner and said 4 words that weren't a question and not an invitation and not a speech. She works my land. The room went quiet, the way a room goes quiet when a man whose name carries weight uses it. The rancher stepped aside. The owner pushed the rice and the sugar across the counter. Elias paid and carried the sack, and they walked out together into the hard white light of the street. 2 people who had both lost a spouse stood on the boardwalk with a sack of rice between them. Something passed between them that wasn't love, and not even trust, but a recognition, the way 2 survivors of the same storm recognize each other across a room. She hadn't asked him to come. He hadn't asked her to stay. They had simply stood where the other needed them, and that was the first honest thing that had happened in that store in a long time. The boy raked the garden on his own now. He came out before the sun was over the ridge, while the yard was still cool and gray. He dragged the stick rake through the dirt in the long parallel lines she'd taught him. He set the stones back when the night wind had shifted them, and he did it without being asked. She had shown him once that the raked lines were water and the stones were islands, that the work was never done because the wind always came back and the lines always broke and the raking started over. The boy didn't say anything about this, but he raked the lines every morning as though his life depended on the order of them. She taught him to fold paper. She'd brought a few sheets from Helena, thin, square sheets the color of the sky at dusk. She sat on the porch in the afternoon and folded one into a crane with a series of precise creases, each one pressed flat with her thumbnail. The boy watched the flat, empty sheet become a thing with a neck and wings, and he couldn't look away. She gave him a sheet and showed him the folds, one at a time. She let him get them wrong and let him crumple the first one and start the second. The lesson she didn't speak was the only lesson that mattered, which was that a flat and empty thing becomes whole only if the hands are steady and the creases aren't forced. His first crane was crooked and the wings sat wrong, and he kept it. He put it on the shelf beside his mother's riding gloves, which was the first time he had willingly touched anything of hers in a year. She folded a second crane and set it beside his, and then a third. The shelf began to fill with small paper birds in the colors of the dusk and the dawn. The boy added his crooked ones to the row and didn't seem to mind that his sat lower than hers, because the row was growing, and the growing was the thing. He folded in the evenings on the porch while the light went out of the sky. His hands grew steadier as the week went on, and the cranes grew truer. She didn't praise the good ones or shame the bad ones. She only set them in the row, and the row itself was the praise. A man who builds something with his hands every day begins to believe his hands are worth something, and a boy is no different. The shelf of cranes was the first evidence the boy had had in a year that his own hands could make a thing worth keeping. This was the gentlest the ranch had been since before Cora died. The afternoons were long and gold, and the boy sat on the porch folding paper and raking the garden and drinking the bitter green tea she made. Whit said the place felt like a home again. Elias heard him and didn't answer, because agreeing would have meant admitting he hadn't been able to make it one himself. The stillness held through that week, and the held quality of it was the thing that made the breaking worse when it came, because the thing a person has just learned to hold is the thing that hurts most to drop. It came on a Saturday. Hannah had finally moved the riding coat from its peg, not to throw it away, but to brush the dust from it and fold it into a cedar box at the foot of the boy's bed. She'd decided the boy's orbit around the coat had lasted long enough, and the coat needed to stop being a shrine and become a thing his hands could touch. The boy came in from the garden and saw the peg empty and saw the coat folded on his bed. The grief that had been held for weeks by rake lines and paper cranes and the turning of a bowl came up out of him like water from a broken well. He tore the crooked crane off the shelf. He went out to the garden and raked straight through the lines he'd built, wrecking them, dragging the rake across the stones. The order of 3 weeks was gone in 30 seconds of an 8-year-old's rage. He ran down the slope before the sun was down, and he didn't come back for supper. He didn't come back when the dark came. The question that had been sleeping under the whole season woke up cold and plain, which was whether the change had been real or only a surface laid over a wound that had never closed. By full dark the boy was gone into the territory night. Elias saddled the fastest horse with his hands shaking in a way they hadn't shaken since the morning Cora's horse came back without her. His instinct was to ride hard, to cover ground, to shout the boy's name across the valley until the sound found him, because that was the frontier answer to a lost thing, which is to throw force at it until it submits. Hannah stopped him at the hitch rail with a look and a single slow shake of her head. Then she did the opposite of everything he was. which is the thing that finally taught him what she'd been teaching the boy all along. She walked to the edge of the yard where the boy's prints still showed in the raked dirt he had torn up. She knelt with the lamp, and she read the ground the way a tracker reads a story, not by force, but by attention. A broken twig, the depth of a heel, the direction the prints leaned when he stumbled. She knew where he was going before Elias did. The prints didn't lead down to the river or out toward the road. They led up, toward the ridge, toward the small fenced plot where Cora lay. Hannah stood up from the ground and said the only full sentence of English she'd spoken all season, slow and careful and absolutely certain. He went to her. Elias went cold, because he hadn't been to the grave since the day they dug it. The going there was the door he'd braced shut for a year. Now a small foreign woman was telling him it was time to walk through it. The night and the boy and 12 months of silence were all on the other side. They found him at the grave. He was sitting in the dirt against the fence, 8 years old and soaking with dew. The words he hadn't spoken for a year were coming out of him in a flood that wasn't words so much as wreckage, the thing he'd held through every fence rail and every barn fire and every silent meal. It was his fault. She'd been looking for him the afternoon she died, because he'd wandered off toward the river the way he always did. She'd taken the horse to find him, and the horse had come back without her. The boy had decided, in the small, clear court of his own mind, that he'd killed his mother. He'd carried the verdict in silence for a year, because there was no court in the territory that would have acquitted him, and no one he could have told. Elias finally broke, and the man who had built his name on silence and stillness knelt in the dirt beside his son. He pulled the boy against his chest. He let the boy hear him cry for the first time in the child's life. The sound of it was the sound of a wall coming down, the brace giving way, the door he'd held shut finally opening, because a small woman with a lamp had shown him it was the only door that led anywhere. He told the boy it wasn't his fault. He said it over and over into the boy's hair. The boy didn't believe him yet, because a thing carried for a year doesn't drop in a single night. But the boy heard it, and the hearing was the crack the rake had made in the stone, the first feeling that lets the next feeling through. Hannah gave them the night. She stood back at the edge of the lamplight and let the father and the son have the ridge and the grave and the grief. When they were ready to walk down, she walked them home, and she didn't speak. She heated water in the kitchen and made tea, and she handed the boy the whisk. He made tea for his father, the small exact turns of the wrist, the foam, the quarter turn of the bowl. He carried it across the kitchen and held it out. Elias took it with hands that weren't steady. The act that had been discipline for weeks became care in that moment. The boy tending the man who hadn't known how to tend him. Something closed in that kitchen that night. The grief wasn't cured, but the boy had been given a way to carry it that didn't require silence or wreckage. A small repeated act he could hold in his hands when the weight of the year pressed down. The boy raked the garden at dawn the next morning, and the morning after, and the morning after that. The lines came back the way she'd told him they would, because the wind always comes, and the raking starts again, and the raking is the point. He made tea for his father each morning before Elias went out to the cattle, the ritual now his, the responsibility he'd chosen. The boy who had broken everything he touched for a year had become a boy who tended things. The tending was steady and small and daily. It was the change that had been waiting under the whole season, though the change wasn't a fix, but a practice. The way a garden isn't a finished thing, but a thing a man keeps. Elias moved the box. He didn't make a speech, because making a speech would have undone the whole quiet architecture of the season. And so he simply carried the lacquered box from the guest room and set it in the room beside his own. The single act said what he couldn't, which was that the protective claim he'd spoken to a store counter had become a real and chosen thing, and not a thing spoken only to end a confrontation. Hannah watched him carry it, and she didn't thank him, and she didn't weep, because she was a woman who had learned long ago not to show the size of a thing by the noise she made over it. She simply moved her few clothes to the room beside his, and the house rearranged itself around the new shape of them. Her own grief came up that week and met theirs, and she let it. She sat on the porch with the boy and told him in her careful, broken English that her husband was buried far from here too, in a port she couldn't return to, that she raked the garden for him as well as for his mother, because the dead don't need the lines raked, but the living do. 2 widowed people and a child sat on that porch in the long gold of the afternoon, tending the same kind of silence. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full, the way a held quiet is full when the people inside it have agreed to hold it together. The boy learned what she'd been teaching him all along, which was that grief isn't defeated, only kept, with steady hands, a little every day. It gets tended the way a garden gets raked, though the wind will always undo it, the way a crane gets folded, though the hands never get it quite right, the way a bowl gets turned toward the one a man loves before he drinks. The last image of the season was the boy kneeling on the kitchen floor, whisking the green powder, turning the bowl so its front faced his father. Hannah standing in the doorway watching him, the way Elias had once watched her. The recognition now returned across the room. The held quiet of the house was the kind of quiet that only comes when the people inside it have stopped running from the thing that broke them and started tending it instead. The boy learned that a flat sheet of paper becomes a crane only when the hands are steady and the creases aren't forced. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. And if it moved you, hit that like button